The Vikings of ancient Scandinavia have a reputation in history for being brutish, bloodthirsty warriors, traveling across oceans in their ingeniously designed longships to either hunt or plunder. Or at least, that's what most would expect. The Vikings were traders, adventurers, farmers, and overall were devoted to their gods. But there is so much more about these seafarers, from the rights of Viking women to their exceptionally strange tales of mythology. I'm Jake, the Voice Pa, and these are 10 things you probably didn't know about the Vikings. If food was scarce, Viking women would have to improvise. One trick was to make bread out of peas, flour, and the secret ingredients, bark from pine trees, and even grit. Substitute bread was filling, but disgusting, hence why it was a last resort recipe. The human stomach cannot digest this sort of stuff easily, but at least it had its fair share of vitamin C from the pine tree bark. Still, we recommend the woodless, rockless bread you can purchase from the supermarket instead. There is a story about the Viking King Canute, though some historians have completely misunderstood it. From the surface, it looks like Canute was having a bit of an ego trip. With many of his followers spectating, the king sat at the edge of the sea and called out, "I command you not to rise over my land and not to wet the clothes or feet of your lord." Unsurprisingly, he was splashed by a wave of salt water. There's more to this story that some people never seem to bother pointing out. Afterwards, he stood up and declared that, as king, his power is weak compared to their true king, God. Canute wasn't trying, and failing miserably, to show off, as some people would have you believe. If it wasn't for the Vikings, our vocabulary would be so less interesting. Words like berserker originated from the Nordic language and literally meant bear shirt. Only the craziest, angriest warriors would wear a bear skin in battle. Other gruesome words include slaughter, ransack, and so on. Are you noticing a pattern here? Bet you didn't know cake originated from the Scandinavian language. The same goes with insults like ugly, weak, or oaf. So be sure to keep this factoid in mind when you're insulting someone. While evidence shows that the human race evolved from apes millions of years ago, according to Norse mythology, the first ever human was sweated out of a giant. It is said that before the beginning of time, there was a black void called Ginnungagap. Two worlds were born there, the icy cold Niflheim and the fiery Muspelheim. Fire and ice collided in the center where the worlds were divided, thus melting the ice. The first ever giant, Ymir, is thawed out. After Ymir slept, he sweated out a male and a female. His legs detached and became his second son. From there on, more giants and the first ever gods came out, who began creating Earth. It is said that Odin, god of healing and death, helped his two brothers carve the first ever humans from a tree. They were sent to Midgard, which is what we call Earth. We think of Vikings as hard-headed warriors who relished in battle. In truth, they loved to write poems and riddles, especially the monks. See if you can solve this head-scratcher about a creature who had, quote, one eye upon 2 ears and 2 feet, 1,200 heads, back on belly, and 2 hands, arms and shoulder, 1 neck, and 2 sides. Say what I am called. What could it be? Some sort of bizarre supernatural monster? Incorrect. It's a one-eyed garlic seller. He clearly had a lot of heads of garlic to sell. Admit it, you were stumped by that one. Hygiene and neatness are not words that usually come to mind when one thinks of the Vikings. Conversely, archaeologists have discovered numerous razors, combs, and tweezers made of antlers and various animal bones that belonged to the Vikings. While most people at the time bathed once a year, the Scandinavians did it weekly. They would also shave and change their clothes frequently, which certainly helped when it came to wooing the opposite sex. Bars of soap were used for washing and bleaching their hair blonde. Vikings loved golden hair just as much as battling. And to think, we thought of them as bulky, sweaty warlords for all this time. Vikings loved a grand feast, especially one with lots of meat and mead. Some rulers organized back-to-back banquets when each feast was finished, which would last for days rather than hours. As you probably expected, they ate hares, boars, and geese. They also hunted seals, the skin was used for clothing and trading, polar bears, and walruses. Ivory was very expensive. In fact, they even hunted whales. Many men to bleed out these scourges of the sea before catching them. They were some of the earliest known whale hunters in history, and their cruelty clearly knew no bounds. Yet, an entire whale offered an incredibly large quantity of food and skin. Before Christopher Columbus accidentally discovered America on his trip to India, the Vikings coincidentally came across the land in 1003. They called it Vinland and named the hostile natives Skraelings. Leif Erikson told his brother Thorvald, who came back a year later for battle, but died. In 1010, they tried to colonize the land, but this proved difficult due to the increasingly hostile nature of the natives and the scarcity of game to hunt. While they did trade with peaceful natives on other nearby islands, they decided to return home after 3 years. Columbus would arrive over 400 years later. Women have often been treated second-rate to men in the past. Yet to say that they've been oppressed in every civilization throughout history is completely and utterly false. Nordic women could claim land as their own. Not as much as the men, but if her children passed away, she could inherit their land as well, and had considerably more power over the uncles and grandparents of the family. They had the power to divorce their husbands, proving that it was down to either poverty, violence, or being forced into another country against her will. If the divorce went through, the wife would receive the property. If the husband demanded the divorce, she would get even more out of it, including the ability to keep the bride price, money given to the other family to persuade them to marry their daughter. Women were most definitely integral to the well-being of the Vikings and had quite a bit more power than you probably expected. There were some colourful tales in Norse mythology. One of the goofiest and most entertaining tales is about Thor, god of thunder, strength, and more. He protected the human world with his mighty enchanted hammer, Mjolnir. According to the legend, the giants stole the hammer. Thor presumed that he could easily get it back if he persuaded Freya, the goddess of love, who was on the hunt for a husband, to wed the lord of the giants. She refused, so it was time for Plan B. Dress up as Freya and visit the giants during a feast. The beard and muscles didn't give his disguise away. Neither did the fact that he ate an entire ox and chugged 3 barrels of mead. They were clearly a very dim race. Once the giants decided to give the hammer to their guest as a gift, Thor ripped off his disguise and single-handedly fought them all for his precious weapon. The moral of the story is, don't mess with a god. Those then are 10 things you probably didn't know about the Vikings. For more top lists just like this, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out our other top lists. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks for learning.